So, hello and welcome to this very special broadcast from Guide London, marking the 75th anniversary of VE Day, the end of the Second World War in Europe. It was a war that had lasted almost 6 years, had caused massive devastation, and had cost millions of lives across the continent. My name is Ruth Polling. I'm a London Blue Badge guide. I'm one of about 600 guides in London who are part of Guide London. And some of you will know that Guide London has been broadcasting 3 times a week on YouTube and Twitter and Facebook. And really, we're aiming to share a little bit of London with you while you can't visit. Today, Londoners and visitors from across the UK and across the world should have been out celebrating the 75th anniversary of the end of the war in Europe and remembering the huge sacrifices of the wartime generation. But of course, in lockdown, we can't do that. And all of those events have been cancelled. So we've been trying to find other ways of marking this hugely important anniversary. At 11 o'clock this morning, people right across the UK observed a 2-minute silence to remember the Second World War and those lives lost. At 3 o'clock this afternoon, many people listened to the rebroadcast of Winston Churchill's speech that he made at 3 p.m. exactly 75 years ago, announcing the German surrender. And this afternoon, I know a lot of people are going to move into a slightly more celebratory mode. The bunting is out and lots of people are going to have a 1940s style afternoon tea as part of their VE Day commemorations at home. As guides, we wanted to find a way that we could mark this hugely significant moment in London and in the world's history. So rather than the normal 30-minute broadcast, today we've got a specially extended broadcast, and I'm joined by 3 of my guiding colleagues to share with you the story of the Second World War and VE Day here in London. So I'm joined by Rob Humphreys, who is going to start us off in a minute or two with a very brief introduction to the Second World War. We'll then hand over to Mike Armitage. Mike's going to tell us a little bit about the war's impact on London itself and on Londoners. What did London look like by VE Day after 6 years of war? And then we'll actually turn to the anniversary that we're marking today with Alice Trickey. And Alice is going to tell us all about the events that actually took place in London on that momentous day 75 years ago and explore some of the stories behind those iconic photographs that you will have seen of the VE Day celebrations in London. So please do join in with us this afternoon. Do let us know how you are marking VE Day in lockdown at home. Leave us comments in the comment section of whichever platform you are using. And I'm going to start by handing over to Rob Humphreys.
Thanks very much, Ruth. I'm Rob Humphreys. Like Ruth, I am a London Blue Badge guide. And I specialise in World War II themed tours. My job today is to try and explain very briefly how we end up at VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, on the 8th of May 1945. So what happened in the Second World War to bring us to that place? And in fact, before I even talk about the Second World War, when you're talking about the origins of the Second World War, you actually have to go back to the First World War. Now, the First World War was fought between 1914 and 1918 between very much the same countries who ended up fighting again in World War II. So in terms of, for us, it was Britain and France with the help of the United States and Russia who were at war with Germany. Now, after 4 years of war, mostly, as you saw in the previous slide there, stagnation in the trenches in the First World War. Millions of soldiers had lost their lives, but the difference was that Germany had lost the war. And so when the peace treaty was drawn up in 1919, the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was blamed for the war. And the Allies sought to exact revenge on Germany, and they did that in several ways. They said that Germany was only allowed a very small army and navy with no air force at all. And as you can see from this map, Germany was forced to give up territory both in the east to Poland, in the west to France, and in the north to Denmark. But most importantly of all, Germany was asked to pay reparations, that is money in compensation to the victorious countries, as it were to say sorry for the First World War. Now, the punishing demands of these reparations led to an economic crash in Germany in 1923. A hyperinflation prompting, in fact, Hitler's first and unsuccessful attempt at seizing power. 6 years later, as you can see from this slide, we had the Great Depression, which was a worldwide economic crash. But in Germany, it was a terrible, there was a terrible impact. 6 million unemployed, which was almost twice what we suffered here in Britain. It was only at this point, with the Depression, that Hitler's Nazi party went from being a fringe party to one that began to gain mass appeal. And one of their messages was they wanted to end the humiliation of the Versailles Treaty of 1919. Now, this was something that actually the majority of Germans believed had been a great injustice, not just those who supported the Nazi party. Hitler also said he would restore German pride, he would bring back economic strength, and he did that once he'd taken power in 1933. The Nazi party actually seized power and immediately began to defy the Versailles Treaty. Rearmament began. The army, which was restricted to 100,000, increased to 1.4 million by 1939. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, was unveiled. That was totally against the Versailles Treaty. And then Hitler started to make demands, territorial demands, on his neighbours, as it were, to make up for the territory that Hitler had lost at the end of the First World War in the Versailles Treaty. First of all, Austria was invaded and annexed to Germany in 1938. Later in that year, Hitler made demands on Czechoslovakia. You can see Czechoslovakia in this slide here. It's in yellow, but the borderlands are in a much paler orange. Those are known as the Sudetenland. They were handed over to Hitler in 1938. Early in 1939, Hitler then, in fact, invaded the rest of the yellow bit of Czechoslovakia. They're the Czech lands, what we would now call the Czech Republic. And at this point, Britain and France realized they needed to take a stand. And so they made a treaty with Poland guaranteeing Poland's borders as they were according to the Versailles Treaty of 1919. So you can just see Poland there on the right-hand side of that map. Sure enough, on September the 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. Now, for us here in Britain and for those in France, this is when we usually think of the beginning of the Second World War. In America and in Russia, a different date is the significant date. But for us, it's the 1st of September 1939, because when Germany refused to retreat from Poland, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Now, there was nothing, in fact, that we could do for Poland. Poland was very quickly overrun by the Germans. And we entered a period which was known as the phony war, because Hitler, in fact, didn't invade any other countries until April of 1940. In fact, on the 4th of April 1940, Neville Chamberlain, who was the Prime Minister in Britain at the time, said that he thought that Hitler had missed the bus. 6 days later, Hitler invaded Denmark and Norway, and in fact, the disastrous campaign to try and defend Norway cost Neville Chamberlain his job. Neville Chamberlain had to resign, and Winston Churchill was elected in his place. as the wartime prime minister in charge of a national government. Now, I know there must be some film fans out there, so for any of you who a few years ago saw the film Darkest Hour, you will know this period. This is a period in which Chamberlain resigned, and actually Churchill, it wasn't as obvious that Churchill was the obvious choice to be prime minister. And there's the picture from the film. Now, Churchill's first day in the office was quite a busy one. 10th of May 1940 was actually when Germany invaded Holland, Belgium and France. And within 2 weeks, the bulk of the British army was hemmed into the French seaport of Dunkirk. Against all the odds, the Royal Navy did manage to evacuate 350,000 troops. You can just see some of them here from the film, again, another film from just a few years ago called Dunkirk, which depicted this event. And if you saw that film, you'll have seen that one of the most miraculous parts of the evacuation was that the Royal Navy requisitioned over 900 little boats, some of them extremely small. Here you can see Tamsin, who was the smallest of all of the Dunkirk little boats, a 15-foot wooden boat, which is preserved to this day in the Imperial War Museum. And if you come to London, you can see this boat as part of the superb Second World War display in the Imperial War Museum, which is just on the other side, on the south side of London, and you can visit it there. There it is. So, although Dunkirk was a miraculous event because we managed to save all those troops, within just a few weeks, France surrendered. So on the 22nd of June 1940, France fell. And at this point, Britain stood alone against Germany. Germany prepared to invade the British Isles. Operation Sea Lion, it was known as. But before the Germans could do that, they needed to have control of the skies. There was no way that their boats could land without that. And so began the Battle of Britain, which was fought primarily above the skies of southeast England. It was the Luftwaffe, Germany's Air Force, against the Royal Air Force. And here you can see two Spitfires flying in formation. Now, the Battle of Britain went in several phases. To begin with, the Germans aimed at the shipping in the Channel, then the radar installations. Then they moved on to the aircraft factories and the airfields themselves to see if they could surprise the RAF and take out some of the planes while they still were on the ground. But in the end, civilian targets were the primary way in which the Battle of Britain was fought. And on the 7th of September, the first mass bombardment of London took place. The 7th of September 1940, and that's what we tend to think of as the beginning of the Blitz. So the Battle of Britain went straight into the Blitz. The Blitz continued until the 10th of May 1941. Now, we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Mike's going to tell you a bit about that. But the most significant thing was that Winston Churchill and his war cabinet actually had to go to an underground bunker to have their meetings. And if you come to London, you can see this underground bunker preserved, beautifully preserved from the 1940s. It's known as the Churchill War Rooms, and over 100 cabinet meetings were held in this underground bunker. And again, if you saw the film Darkest Hour, many of the shots in that film were not actually filmed there, but filmed on a film set which was based on these very rooms. Now, the Blitz ended on May the 10th, 1941. On that night, the Houses of Parliament were actually hit, but Big Ben survived, so you can see that still, and the repaired Houses of Parliament. Why did Hitler stop bombing Britain? He had actually given up on invading Britain, turned his attention instead to the Soviet Union. And on the 22nd of June 1941, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. It was probably the biggest mistake that he made in the whole of the Second World War. It was one of two fatal decisions. After 3 years of conflict on the Eastern Front, which took up 80% of Germany's armed forces, Germany did not, in fact, defeat the Soviet Union. And in December the 9th, 1941, Hitler made a second fatal decision, because that is when the Japanese made a surprise attack on America and brought the Americans into the war. The Americans declared war on Japan, but they didn't declare war on Germany until Hitler himself declared war on the USA, which is something he didn't actually have to do. So now Germany found itself once again, just as in the First World War, battling against Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and the United States of America. Now, on the Western Front, the biggest day for us is D-Day, because it took until June the 6th, 1944, for the Allies in the West to actually open up a second front, landing on the beaches of D-Day, of Normandy on D-Day. And on the 6th of June 1944, we bombed the beaches. And if you come to London, you will see HMS Belfast, which is in this picture here, moored on the River Thames, and you can visit it. It's a museum ship, but it was one of the first ships to take part in the bombardment on that day, on June the 6th. In less than a year, American and Russian troops had met up outside Berlin. A few days later, Hitler committed suicide. The Battle of Berlin continued until May the 7th. On May the 7th, 1945, an unconditional surrender was signed by the German military in France, and again in Berlin the following evening. Now, the plan was that all the Allied powers would celebrate VE Day on May the 9th, 1945. As it turned out, it didn't quite manage that because there was a leak. And so, as Alice will tell us later, it was celebrated on May the 8th, 1945, certainly in the West. So I think that's taken us up to VE Day. I'll hand back over to Ruth.
Thanks, Rob. So we're now going to turn to a city that was awaiting that news of the German surrender that Rob described. London, a city which had suffered bombing since 1940. I'm going to hand over to Mike, who's going to tell us more about London during the war and what London was like by 1945.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. So yeah, I'm Mike Armitage. Like everybody else here, I'm a Blue Badge guide, and I guide anywhere in London, but a bit like Rob, I specialise in the First and Second World War. Anyway, 8th of May 1945, Britain and its chief port and its capital city, London, had been at war for almost 6 years. Throughout that time, there had been rationing. Both clothes and food rationing, and the food ration had slowly got smaller and smaller throughout the war. So by VE Day, most Londoners, whilst they weren't starving, they were certainly had a constant feeling of hunger. But despite London being a bit grey and drab, it was exciting, it was busy, it had been the centre of world affairs since 1940. And London was full of people from all over the world, servicemen, civilians. We had people from occupied Europe, the Free French, the Poles, the Dutch, the Norwegian. There were soldiers and servicemen from all over the empire, from New Zealand, from Australia, from Canada, South Africa, India. And even though it was nearly 11 months since D-Day, there were still plenty of Americans in London, both the senior officers, the two chaps on the left-hand side, and more junior ranks. On the right-hand side, there's I think he's a second lieutenant, making a point, shall we say, to an array at Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park. Most Londoners in some way were involved in war work, and many of them were in uniform. It wasn't just the soldiers, the sailors and the airmen. The chap on the left of the left-hand photograph is a leading aircraftsman in the Royal Air Force, but everybody else in those two pictures is in the civilian defence. The chap next to the RAF man, I happen to know, is 60 years old and was actually a veteran of the First World War. Those are First World War ribbons he's wearing. Lots of women were in uniform as well. They were wearing the uniforms like the lady on the left of the Women's Land Army, or they were ambulance drivers, they were in the fire service, they were in the American or the British Red Cross, and they were in the Women's Voluntary Service. Some of them, this was their main job, but with many others, they were volunteers. This was what they did in addition to their normal daytime work. Now, London had been subjected to bombing for a long time. For 5 of the 6 years it had been at war, it had been bombed. This had varied in intensity over the years, but it was still going on in 1945. This picture here shows which is London's main meat market, at 11:30 a.m. on the 8th of March 1945. And at that time, a German V2 missile fired from Holland landed on the market, flattened the western end of it, and killed 110 people. The market itself was rebuilt and still continues to this day, London's main wholesale meat market. And the west end, this end here, is currently being redeveloped and will become the new Museum of London, and it's due to open in 2024. When I'm doing my war walks, I'm often asked whether London was flattened during the war, whether it was destroyed by the bombing. And the answer to that is a definite no. London is a big city. It takes a lot of knocking down. And this is just by St. Paul's. This photograph was taken about February 1945. And although you can see there's a lot of devastation, the foreground is taken up with cleared, bombed buildings. Behind is still standing. The small office block on the left is still standing. And this is one of the most devastated areas of central London. Wasn't quite as badly damaged as the East End and the docks, but certainly in tourist London, if I can put it like that, this was the most devastated area. And the next picture shows Whitehall, the centre of British government, on the 8th of May 1945. And these are the government buildings. These were built at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century as the grand buildings of an imperial capital. And although they've seen better days, they're a bit shabby, a bit grubby, and the windows are partially blocked up, they're still standing and they're still functioning as government offices. I'll just briefly mention the white column on the right with the flags on it, which you can see in the next picture. That's the cenotaph, the national memorial in 1945 to the dead of the First World War. And this is the same street scene today. They're the same buildings, but you can see they've been smartened and cleaned up. And of course, the cenotaph has had the dates 1939 to 1945 added to it. Of course, many old historic buildings were destroyed. This is St Clement Danes Church on the western end of Fleet Street at the height of the Blitz, and clearly it is being gutted by fire. You may notice the little steeple on the left. That's the steeple of the Law Courts. And at the end of the war in 1945, it looked like this. These are two photographs taken in about January and June, and you can see it's been completely gutted. There's no roof, there are no windows, there's no internal fittings, there's no plaster. But the church was rebuilt. It took 13 years, and now you can see it in the left-hand picture, again with the steeple of the Law Courts in the background, and it's now the central church of the Royal Air Force in this country. But if you look at the eastern end of the church, which is the picture on the right, even today you can see the damage on the walls caused by high explosive bombs in the Second World War. Not every building was rebuilt. This is another church, St Dunstan's in the east, which was also gutted by fire during the Blitz. And this has been rebuilt or repurposed, if you will, as a small public garden in the financial district of London, in amongst all the glass and steel and chrome buildings. It gives the office workers somewhere to go and eat their sandwiches and have a sliced cigarette. But as well as the private gardens, the small public buildings, London is famous for its large green open spaces, its royal parks, and many of these were turned over to war work. And a lot of them were turned over to growing food. These are allotments, small pieces of land that were provided for people to grow their own food, primarily vegetables, for their own and their family's consumption. The man in the background here is also in uniform. He's another member of the Civil Defence organisation, and this is Kensington Gardens, and you can just see the Albert Memorial in the background, this spiky spire-shaped building. And the next photograph shows the Albert Memorial today from the same angle, been cleaned up, and the statue of Prince Albert in the middle, which is quite small in this photograph, has been re-gilded. So nowadays, on a sunny day, which we do get in London, it glistens in the sunshine. By 1945, the threat of German invasion had gone. but many of the defensive positions that have been built to counter the threat of German invasion were still there. This photo here is just outside the Houses of Parliament. The big black building to the left is Big Ben, and against the skyline you can see two white square towers, and this is Westminster Abbey. You'll see a policeman at the front directing traffic, and you can tell this is wartime because he's wearing a tin hat rather than traditional policeman's hat. And the traffic bollards on the right-hand side of the picture, if you look closely, have got the traces of the black and white paint that's put on them to make them visible during the blackout. But I really want to draw your attention to the thing I've circled in red, the structure that's actually blocking the footpath, so the man in the suit has had to walk round it. It's designed to look like the wall behind it, but in fact it's made of reinforced concrete and is a machine gun post designed to pour fire onto any enemy troops who cross Westminster Bridge, which is to the left of the picture, or coming up Victoria Embankment from the right-hand side picture. This is one end of Whitehall. At the other end of Whitehall is Horse Guards Parade. This is a modern picture of it. It's a large open parade ground in London, mainly used for the Queen's birthday parade, although for the 2012 London Olympics they did have the beach volleyball here. But I've put this picture up to show you the large slab-sided building on the left-hand side. This is the Admiralty Citadel, built in 1941 as a bomb-proof headquarters for the British Royal Navy. And if you look at it today, it is still there. It's so solidly built, it's very difficult to get rid of. If you look at it today, you can still see the machine gun positions, the embrasures, the loopholes, which would be used for defending it in the case of attack. The green leaves all over it were planted just after the war. It's Boston ivy, and it was planted in a not entirely successful attempt to hide the sheer brutal nature of this building. Horse Guards Parade was defended during the war. There's a picture coming up showing a light machine gun position, but this was earlier on in the war. By 1945, these had been removed, and the parade ground was used for military parades, but it was also used for showing captured German equipment, like the planes or the tank you can see in these two pictures. If you still want to see some of the planes, the Heinkel 111 bomber right at the back is still on display in London. It's currently in the Royal Air Force Museum in Hendon in North London. The tank, the Tiger tank on the bottom, which was captured in North Africa, appeared with Brad Pitt in the 2014 film Fury, and you can now see that at the Tank Museum in Dorset, about 120 miles southwest of London. About 100 yards further down from here is the Cabinet War Rooms, mentioned briefly by Rob, and these were still in use in 1945, and they were still secret. Even on VE Day, they were in use because we were still at war with the Japanese. They were a complete secret, absolutely top secret. They were supposed to be Navy map stores to anybody who didn't need to know what was going on there. But today, they have been, they're open to the public. They've been rebranded as the Churchill War Rooms. And Rob mentioned them briefly. They're well worth a visit. They are a 1940s time capsule, if you like, with original furniture, original signs, original maps on the wall. It's even got the original ashtrays and the original nicotine-stained walls. It also has a rather nice museum dedicated to Winston Churchill. So, that was London on VE Day. It was battered, it was hungry, it was even perhaps a little shabby, but it was not destroyed, and it certainly wasn't defeated.
Thanks so much, Mike. And Mike really conjured up how London felt on VE Day. This was the city that was waiting for news. But actually, the wait turned out to be longer than might have been expected. By May 1945, rumours of the German surrender had been circulating for weeks. But when the German surrender was actually signed at 2:41 in the morning on the 7th of May, the news was not immediately broadcast to the people of London. The terms of the surrender meant that actually the hostilities wouldn't end until 2301 on the 8th of May, nearly 48 hours after the surrender was signed. And so with that in mind, and also with the desire of all three of the major allies, not just Britain, but the Soviet Union and the United States as well, to make the announcement simultaneously, the news wasn't communicated to the British people on the morning of the 7th. In fact, by the afternoon, the rumours really had ramped up that Germany had surrendered. And it wasn't until 7:40 in the evening that there was an official confirmation. The news everybody had been waiting for was finally confirmed. It wasn't quite as glamorous as it sounds. It was actually just a brief interruption to the BBC's normal programming that evening. The BBC announced, in accordance with arrangements between the three great powers, an official announcement will be broadcast by the Prime Minister at 3 o'clock tomorrow, Tuesday afternoon, 8th of May. In view of this fact, tomorrow, Tuesday, will be treated as Victory in Europe Day. This was followed by the announcement that Victory in Europe Day would be a public holiday. But that was it. Far from the kind of detailed planning that we're used to, the very organised celebrations that we've had for the anniversaries of VE Day. On the original VE Day, the British government gave Londoners very little guidance on what was actually going to happen. In advance, the Home Office had declared that bonfires will be allowed, but the government trusts that only material with no salvage value will be used. And the Board of Trade had given a very slight relaxation to the rationing that Mike talked about. They announced until the end of May, you may buy cotton bunting without coupons, providing it is red, white, or blue. Now, despite this, it wasn't much planning, but the announcement was all the encouragement that many people needed. In fact, many people didn't wait for the official VE Day on the 8th of May. They started their celebrations on that evening of the 7th. Across the country, bonfires were lit, bunting started to go up in towns and cities and villages, and plans were arranged for local areas for the following day. Others, however, complained. They felt the government had badly mishandled the announcement. And two women who were overheard on the morning of the 8th of May in a shop in central London kind of summed up the mood of many at the beginning of VE Day. One of them said, "They played us a dirty trick, a proper dirty trick." The other woman agreed. She said people were waiting and waiting and nothing happened. But for many, despite the confusion, the lack of organised events, there was only one place that they wanted to be on VE Day. And that was, of course, in central London. It didn't matter that they didn't know what they were going to see when they got there, or they didn't know what was planned. Lots of people just expressed the desire to be there on that momentous day. And Alice is going to tell us now about what they experienced.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Ruth. My name is Alice Trickey. I'm also a London Blue Badge Guide. And on the 8th of May, 1945, a US Army Signal Corps photographer, identified only as T.G. Mascar, would capture two women frolicking with two British sailors in one of the fountains in Trafalgar Square, smiling broadly at the camera, trousers rolled up, arms around each other. This photo became famous across the world. But the story of these two women, uncovered by the Imperial War Museum in 2015, didn't just give us an iconic image. It also allows us a fascinating personal insight into the experience of ordinary people on that extraordinary day. Cynthia Covello and Joyce Digney had first met when they joined the Women's Land Army in the summer of 1944. Joyce was 18 and Cynthia was 20 years old. They became firm friends, working together on various farms across Surrey, just outside of London. During the war, they had both agreed that if they were still alive at the end of the conflict, they would make the trip into London to join in with the inevitable celebrations. So that Tuesday morning, the two friends caught an early train into London and headed out into the city. London was buzzing. Huge crowds had been flocking to London's landmarks throughout the morning, and the streets were packed with people. You can see on the screen the crowds that have gathered in Parliament Square. You might just be able to make out Westminster Abbey right in the background. A joyous carnival atmosphere filled the air. Joyce would later recall, "We walked all over London, and unless you were there, you could not believe the euphoria. Hugs, kisses, smiles and laughter. It was like a gigantic family coming together." As they walked, the two friends would have seen a city transformed into a kaleidoscope of colour. People wore rosettes and ribbons of red, white and blue. Buildings were festooned with bunting, and there were hawkers on every street corner selling flags of all the allies. You can see one of them here, just outside of Horse Guards. Many parts of the capital became impromptu playgrounds and dance floors, music provided by gramophones, accordions, barrel organs rang out across the city as revellers sang and danced to the popular tunes of the day. In the image on the left-hand side, you can see, amid a confetti of paper that's been cast out of the office windows, some of the young women who worked for the US government's Office of War Information. They've spilled out onto the streets to dance the jitterbug with American GIs. On the right, servicemen and civilians can be seen dancing in tight circles in Berkeley Square. In Piccadilly Circus, soldiers competed to climb to the top of the pyramid of hoardings that were erected to protect the copper pedestal on which the statue of Eros, this is a winged figure holding a bow, normally stood. It had been moved earlier in the war to protect it from German bombing. Along Piccadilly, strangers linked arm in arm like old friends, marching along the streets, singing and shouting, all inhibition forgotten. One Londoner remembers how cars passed us with people riding on the hoods and bonnets. Here's a group making their way along the Strand. Everyone was just letting themselves go. At 3 p.m, Winston Churchill addressed the nation from 10 Downing Street, formally announcing the German surrender. Cynthia and Joyce may have heard the speech broadcast on the loudspeakers set up to relay the Prime Minister's words to the crowds gathered across London. Afterwards, Churchill made his way to the Palace of Westminster to deliver the news to the assembled Houses of Parliament. You can see the hordes of people gathered around Parliament Square on the right-hand side, and on the left you can see the famous clock tower, Big Ben. It took Churchill nearly half an hour to travel a quarter of a mile, standing on the front seat of an open car, giving his V for victory sign as he travelled slowly through the throng. Meanwhile, a vast crowd had gathered outside of Buckingham Palace, the official residence of the monarch in London. They were desperate to catch a glimpse of the King and Queen, and they would not be disappointed. At around 3:30, the royal family appeared on the palace balcony, which was draped in scarlet and gold. Smiling broadly, the King, George VI, wearing naval uniform, accompanied by the Queen and Princess Margaret in blue, as well as the Princess Elizabeth. You can see her on the far left of this image, in her khaki Women's Auxiliary Territorial Service uniform, came out to wave at the cheering crowds. Princess Elizabeth is, of course, today, the Queen, Elizabeth II. The royal family played a central role in the celebrations on VE Day, appearing on the balcony of Buckingham Palace 8 times over the course of the day. Later that afternoon, the King received Winston Churchill and members of the War Cabinet in the Bow Room of Buckingham Palace, every window of which had been smashed by a flying bomb earlier that year. At around 5:30 p.m, Churchill accompanied the royal family onto the balcony. You can see him here, before driving back to Whitehall to address a mass of 50,000 people from the balcony of the Ministry of Health. The Ministry of Health is the building you can see on the right-hand side of the screen. In an impromptu speech to the roaring crowd, he declared, "In all our history, we have never seen a greater day. This is your hour. This is your victory. It is not a victory of a party or of any class. It is a victory of the great British nation as a whole." In Trafalgar Square, meanwhile, Cynthia and Joyce were dipping into the Chandos. This is a pub just off the square on St Martin's Lane, very close to the church of St Martin in the Fields. If you look carefully at the image on the left-hand side, you might be able to make out on the far left the distinctive spire of St Martin's. The pub was overflowing, and although the Prime Minister Winston Churchill had gained assurances from the Ministry of Food that there were enough beer supplies in the capital to slake the thirst of revellers, there were not, unfortunately, enough glasses. Despite this, Cynthia somehow managed to procure drinks, and after their trip to the pub, the two of them made their way into Trafalgar Square, where the celebrations were in full swing. You can see in the photo on the left, the hastily erected boards around the base of Nelson's column at the front and centre of the square, proclaiming "Victory over Germany, 1945. Policemen looked the other way as revellers climbed on the 4 lion statues around the base of the column. You can see some of them in the image on the right-hand side, and a giant conga line snaked its way around the statues and fountains. It was a warm, humid day, and many people were sitting in the fountains, wading their feet in the water to cool off. Cynthia and Joyce decided to join them. Taking off their shoes, rolling up their trousers, they stepped into the water. Their exploits, captured by photographers and cameramen, would become some of the defining images of the VE Day celebrations. Joyce remembers 2 sailors came into the fountain to join us. One of them climbed up onto one of the fountains and dived into 2 feet of water. How he didn't kill himself, I don't know. He put his arm around me and fell back, taking me under the water with him. I grabbed the chap by the shirt and dunked him up and down, screaming, "Look what you've done to me. How am I going to get home?" I think that's probably what you can see in the image on the screen now. After the dunking, the 2 women headed south, back to Waterloo Station, drying off next to one of the many bonfires that had been lit across the city before taking the train back to Surrey. I'm not sure if they managed to catch the King's speech, broadcast at 9 p.m. that evening. At 13 minutes, it was the longest of his life and reign. And tonight at 9 p.m, a pre-recorded address by Her Majesty the Queen will be broadcast on BBC One at the exact moment her father gave his radio address 75 years ago. In 1945, crowds swarmed into the hotels along Piccadilly to listen to the King. According to the Daily Telegraph, one hotel guest was so overcome by the King's address that she flung a wickerwork flower stand into the lift mechanism, trapping the liftman between two floors. The celebrations continued well into the night. As darkness fell, after years of enforced blackout, public buildings and landmarks, including the Houses of Parliament, you can see Big Ben here on the screen, Piccadilly Circus and Buckingham Palace were illuminated by floodlights, much to the delight of the crowds. Licensing hours had been extended so that people could raise a toast or two to the end of the war, and dance halls stayed open until midnight. At midnight, an estimated 50,000 people were still crowded in Piccadilly Circus, some of them dancing in the streets around blazing bonfires to the sound of fireworks being let off. One Londoner describes how it really was a wonderful night, never to be forgotten. Cynthia and Joyce may have headed for home, but the adventures of two other young women that evening have become almost legendary. After the King's speech and another appearance by the royal family on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, the two princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret, slipped out, accompanied by a group of friends and guards officers, into the streets to secretly mingle with the jubilant crowds. They danced the conga, the Lambeth Walk, and the Hokey Cokey before returning to the palace to stand with the crowd and shout, "We want the King," before returning inside. Elizabeth, who was 19 at the time, later described VE Day as one of the most memorable nights of my life. VE Day was one that remained in the memory of all those who witnessed it. Noel Coward, the actor and playwright, later called it the greatest day in our history. As for Joyce and Cynthia, the last image you would have seen on the screen, they married Canadian soldiers and moved to Canada shortly after the end of the war. The two stayed in touch, and although both have now sadly passed away, their shared moment of joyous exuberance still has the power to take us back to that momentous day 75 years ago. If, like them, you are planning a visit to London once travel resumes, all the sites I've mentioned, so Trafalgar Square, Piccadilly Circus, Buckingham Palace, are still here. You too can experience the places where history happened and that made London such an exciting city today.
Thanks, Alice. And that wonderful photo, your final image, I think really sums up the sheer joy of VE Day, the celebration of victory that we are marking 75 years on today. But we should also remember that, of course, that victory came at huge cost. So many of those who were celebrating the end of the war, they were happy to see the war end, but they were also devastated by personal loss. Joy and Cynthia themselves had lost people close to them during the war. And years later, when Joyce spoke to the researchers from the Imperial War Museum, she actually revealed that before they went and danced in the fountains in Trafalgar Square, in fact, Joyce and Cynthia's first stop in London on VE Day was St Paul's Cathedral. And by going to visit St Paul's Cathedral, they said prayers for those that they had lost during this terrible conflict. They weren't alone in heading to St Paul's. In fact, St Paul's held at 10 services on VE Day itself, and St Paul's estimates that 30,000 people attended one of those services during the day. The building itself, as you can see from this image, was suffering the scars of war. The east end of the church had been heavily damaged, but it was still standing. It was still providing those services of Thanksgiving on VE Day, and attempting to provide some comfort to those who'd suffered so much loss. If you visit St Paul's Cathedral today, well, the East End has been rebuilt, but the war hasn't been forgotten. This is what you'll find at the East End of St Paul's Cathedral today. Very movingly, it is the American Memorial Chapel, and it's dedicated to the memory of the American servicemen who spent part of their service in Britain and were killed during the Second World War. The altar of St Paul's, damaged by bombing, had to be replaced, and this new altar that you can see here is dedicated to the servicemen of Britain's then Empire and the Commonwealth who served and were killed in both the First and the Second World Wars. London's other great church, Westminster Abbey, also provided short services of Thanksgiving on VE Day. In fact, even more than St Paul's, they held a service every hour from 9 o'clock in the morning until 10 o'clock on VE Day. And they think about 25,000 people attended one of those services. It wasn't just the big famous London churches that provided services on VE Day. In fact, right across the country, people attended the services as a chance to remember amongst all the celebrations of the day. Muriel Green shared her recollection of a service on VE Day that was held in her local assembly hall. Now, she shared it with an organisation called Mass Observation, who are a truly astounding organisation, a sociological survey that asked people to, just ordinary people, to contribute their thoughts on their lives. And Mass Observation operated right through the Second World War. So it gives us this amazing capture of how people thought and felt. And Muriel wrote up her experiences of VE Day on the 8th of May 1945. Early in the day, she described herself as being just too jolly. But when she writes about the service in the Assembly Hall, she says she became aware during the proceedings that the housekeeper was crying. And she notes to Mass Observation that the housekeeper had lost her dearest son. For those who'd lost a close relative, grief rather than celebration was often the overwhelming feeling on VE Day. Others felt overwhelmed not just by their personal loss, but by the sheer horror of the Second World War. Another contributor to Mass Observation wrote, "Once or twice I thought of the good things that can now come, but always two things would intrude: Tom and Belsen, the Nazi concentration camp that had been liberated by the British less than a month before, and horrific stories filtering back to Britain." For those who were serving in Europe on VE Day, of course, their minds turned to the horrific things that they had seen, and particularly to their fallen comrades. Martin Hauser was a sergeant with the British Army. He was at Trieste on VE Day, and he wrote, "I hold a glass of beer in my hand and my thoughts wander. Here we sit, a group of men happy to have got through these years. But where is the joy, the enthusiasm that can be expected of us? Not a bit of it. A smile here, a chuckle there, a joke as we drink our beer. Time passes with an exchange of memories. The past weighs heavily on everyone." It fell to the BBC, who broadcast throughout VE Day, to capture not just the joy of the occasion, but this huge mix of people, mix of emotions that people felt right across the UK and abroad. The BBC's broadcasts from Trafalgar Square, from Buckingham Palace, absolutely capture that party atmosphere that Alice was talking about. Much of the day on the BBC was dedicated to dance bands and to popular music, but they also broadcast 3 church services during the day. And they also broadcast an extraordinarily somber piece from the man whose photograph you can see on the screen. This is Winford Vaughan Thomas, and he broadcast from a small German town on VE Day as the terms of the German surrender were broadcast to the residents of that town. So there was clearly no one single mood on VE Day, but most listeners seem to think that the BBC had captured the range of moods and got the balance right in their coverage. In fact, the BBC's listener research department recorded the best ever programme satisfaction figures for its VE Day coverage. Personally, looking back, I think one of the wonderful things about the coverage of that day is the opportunity that the BBC gave for ordinary people to talk about their experiences on VE Day, whether they were incredibly joyful or incredibly sad. The BBC's early evening programme was called Standing at the Corner, and it was interviews with people in London, in Birmingham, in Liverpool, Glasgow, and elsewhere in the UK. It's quite clear that the wild partying in central London that Alice described wasn't repeated right across the country. But in local communities, there were incredibly joyful celebrations, street parties, parades, and bonfires. Even where there wasn't actually much in the way of celebration, mass observation records that a huge amount of effort was put in by the British people into decorating their homes with the bunting of red, white, and blue. Many people chose to spend VE Day not out in a big party, but at home with friends and family, which meant so much to them, or at smaller events within their local communities. These more low-key events, I think, in many ways, allowed them to reflect on really mixed emotions that they felt that day. That mix of emotions was also reflected in the BBC's Victory Report, which was broadcast at 9:30 on the 8th of May, immediately after the King's broadcast. It had pre-recorded messages from all of those you would expect, from General Eisenhower, from Field Marshal Montgomery, but it also had a segment with contributions from Private William Nelson and driver Wally Gibson. The man on the screen is an actor, Tommy Trinder. On the screen, he's appearing in a still from a Ministry of Information film of 1941 with his co-star. But on the night of VE Day, he was sent by the BBC down to Lambeth, a working class area of London. And his broadcast, you can hear in the background the whole time he's speaking, the joyful singing. From Hull, listeners could hear the reflections of Mrs. Lawson. But I think one of the most moving segments of the whole day was a talk from Mrs. MacDonald. She was a mother from Glasgow, and she mentions in her broadcast how nice it was to see so many happy people. But she said, for many a mother in the British Isles, this night must hold sad memories as well as joy, maybe more sadness than joy for some. And she must have been one of them. One of her sons, Roy, had been killed, and another had lost his leg while serving with the British Army. And her fears for her sons were not over with VE Day, because 2 of her other sons were still serving, and they weren't serving in Europe where the war was over. They were serving in Southeast Asia. She describes the war as only half done, And for many of those serving in Asia and their families, it must really have felt like that on the night of VE Day. Those serving and their families in Asia, you know, the war was not over on VE Day. On the 8th of May 1945, they had no way of knowing how long it was going to take to defeat the Japanese and for the war to come to a final end. The British 14th Army was engaged in an absolutely brutal campaign in Myanmar, which at the time was known as Burma. And they expressed their sentiments on VE Day in a very terse communique. It said, "The war is over. Let us get on with the war." Men serving in Europe wondered if they were going to be redeployed to Asia. And so for many servicemen, for those who were prisoners of war, their families, the fears and uncertainties continue right through VE Day and for months afterwards. In fact, looking back 75 years on, I think one of the most surprising things that comes out of the accounts that were written at the time is the level of uncertainty that so many people expressed on VE Day. Not just their continued uncertainties about the war in the East, but uncertainties about what would happen next. So many people remembered the massive unemployment that had come after the First World War. Londoners, even as they partied and celebrated, if they looked around them, saw how much effort would need to go into rebuilding their bombed city. And of course, many people wondered whether the new world created by this war would just lead to another war, as the First World War had led to the Second. I think looking back today, we can see VE Day as the closing of one of the darkest chapters in London's history. But we need to know it brought no certainty about what the next chapter would be. I mean, there was relief and joy, as you can see in this picture from West London here. And I think a lot of that relief and joy, it came from the fact that while the war continued, the physical closeness of the war to London, the bombing that had claimed over 30,000 lives in London alone, was finally over. As Tommy Trinder said, 6 years of bombing, blackouts and suffering. No more HEs, no more incendiaries, no more flying bombs, no more rockets. It's all over. On the 75th anniversary, we remember the sacrifice and the terrible losses of the Second World War. And we celebrate the 75th anniversary of that war being over in Europe. That's a mix of emotions that people felt on that day 75 years ago. Of course, today, we really celebrate the men and women who fought and won the war. And we celebrate how after the war, they turned their energy and commitment to overcome those uncertainties expressed on VE Day, to rebuild their lives, their communities, their city and their country. Many of the accounts of that day, 75 years ago, mention light. And you'll see in that last picture shown that image of light. Alice expressed in her presentation about how the crowd was so excited after the enforced blackouts over London to see the lights go on at Big Ben, the House of Parliament, and at Buckingham Palace. And this is actually my favourite image of VE Day 75 years ago. This is St Paul's Cathedral. It's damaged, but it's still standing, and it is beautifully floodlit on the night of the 8th of May 1945. Just looking at this picture, it feels like the start of a new chapter for London. So that's all we have time for this VE Day anniversary broadcast today. Thank you so much for being part of this very special broadcast where we've marked one of the most important events in London's and in world history. There's more information on the Second World War in London and VE Day and all the sites that we've talked about today on the Guide London website. And we will be broadcasting again next week. But Just before we go, I do want to thank Rob, Mike and Alice for sharing their thoughts with us today. And I want to thank you again for being part of the broadcast. However we mark VE Day today in lockdown, in whatever ways we can on this 75th anniversary, I think all together we are remembering the huge sacrifices, and we're celebrating and thanking that amazing wartime generation. Thank you.